So this question is a deduction type question, which means our goal is to determine whether the conclusion, which we see here in bold, follows from the statements or premises above. So let's start by simply reading the conclusion, which says, some producers of renewable energy will one day need to operate without government subsidies. So again, the goal is to determine whether this conclusion follows or does not follow from the statements above. So let's keep that conclusion in mind as we read the statements, which say, some producers of renewable energy rely heavily on government subsidies. All companies that rely heavily on government subsidies will one day have to manage without them. Therefore, and then we have our conclusion, which is what we are evaluating. So we can work through this using the help of this diagram here at the bottom right, where we see 3 concentric shapes, 2 circles, and an ellipse. So we can map the statements onto this diagram to determine whether or not the conclusion follows. So let's go ahead and reread the beginning of the statements. Some producers of renewable energy rely heavily on government subsidies. So this means we have a total amount of renewable energy producers, and some of them rely heavily on government subsidies. So we can essentially break this in half, and we can call this first portion A and the second portion B. So A is referring to the renewable energy producers, and B refers to those that rely heavily on government subsidies. So we have A, which is this ellipse. This is all of the renewable energy producers. And then we have B, which is this circle, which represents the companies that rely heavily on government subsidies. And then we have this overlapping region here, where A and B are concentric. This is representative of the portion of renewable energy producers that rely heavily on government subsidies. And then if we continue reading the statements, all companies that rely heavily on government subsidies will one day have to manage without them. So that's what we see in C. This large circle represents all of the companies, whether or not they rely on government subsidies at one point, eventually will not be able to. They will have to manage without them. So with that in mind, and we can also label this C just as a reminder, with that in mind, let's reread the conclusion. Some producers of renewable energy will one day need to operate without government subsidies. So we can see through this diagram that this is correct. We have A, we have some amount of renewable energy producers, and then we have some overlapping portion that rely on government subsidies. But we know that all companies, including that portion that rely heavily on government subsidies, eventually will have to manage without them. And therefore, some producers of renewable energy will one day need to operate without government subsidies. And the conclusion follows.